Welcome to the Hemlane Hustle, the podcast where we deep dive into the world of real estate, landlord life, and all the hustle it takes to stay on top. Today, we've got someone who knows the game better than most. She's a powerhouse attorney and the go-to advocate for all things California tenant landlord law, Eileen Kendall. One of Eileen's successes has been handling adverse possession cases where she demonstrated her exceptional legal acumen and ability to obtain judgment, granting title of the property to her client. Her clients appreciate her in-depth knowledge, strategic approach, and unwavering dedication to protecting their best interests and their assets. Eileen, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Great. Well, this is going to be a really in-depth, deep conversation today that I'm so excited about, in part because tenant landlord law in California, I think, scares a lot of even California residents away from investing in California, so much so that I think a lot of California residents I know invest out of state. So I really want to dive deep into that and what tenant landlord law is like, how to make sure that you don't have an eviction, avoiding the most costly expense there. And so I want to just start with adverse possession. You're our subject matter expert there. Would love for you just to define that first and then talk about some high stakes real property cases that you've seen.
Yeah, so adverse possession in the legal community, people laugh like you really did one of those because it's something that seems archaic when you're learning it in law school. And basically the idea is if you possess a piece of property openly, the word they use is notoriously, for an extended period of time. It varies from state to state, but it's generally 5 to 7 years. You pay the property taxes and you just hold out yourself as the owner of this property. You can obtain title to the property. You see it in abandoned properties. So if there's an area that's high in foreclosures, banks that are these REO properties have to be very careful because if somebody goes in there and squats and does so for an extended period of time, goes down to the county and pays the taxes, they could legally get title to that property. And that's kind of exactly what happened in the case that I had. It had been a property that was kind of in the family. The person had died in the 70s and a girlfriend kind of stayed on. Then that person went into a nursing home and my clients kind of moved in. It was totally, black mold, totally nasty. And they just gutted it, finished it, started paying the property taxes on it. And 12 years later, it started at another firm, but the firm filed the action for adverse possession. And it's pretty basic with the elements, but it was kind of a circus that we had to manage because you had heirs from the person that died in the 70s on one side. Then on the other side of the defendants, you have the granddaughter of the girlfriend trying to claim some common law marriage right to it, and then us as the plaintiffs. Took about 6 days of a bench trial, and we were able to obtain title to the property for our clients. I mean, you still have to deal with the property issue of taxes going up once you make that transfer, but essentially they got title to property with just having to do a remodel and paying taxes for 12 years.
Wow. And so this is actually on the other side of the equation because they didn't own this property and they didn't have title. So they very well knew what they were doing of going in and saying, hey, we're actually there's no one here. The person has passed away. We'll just go in and essentially squat, if that's an okay word for me to use, do some renovations, live here, and paid the title knowing that after, what was it, 7 years, you said that
Yeah.
they can take title.
Yeah.
Question for you on
Yeah.
that. When they were paying the title, how did they even come across that? Was there some mail in the mail that said something is due? Did they just go down and realize no one else was paying it? Or how did they think about that? And then also, did they speak with a lawyer beforehand and actively do this? Or how did they even think to actually take possession of this property and not have to pay anything for it except for the taxes and title. What was that whole process, and what was going through your client's mind?
Yeah, I don't think that they talked to an attorney in advance because you could tell the one thing that was going to be problematic in our case was a document that they drafted between them and one of the people that were sort of involved with who lived in the property before. Luckily, I found case law and I was able to defeat it. But yeah, they definitely didn't talk to somebody before the process. My guess is they did a little bit of, you know, internet research to find out,
Mhm.
because you could definitely tell by the document that they tried to draft that's what they intended to do. And as for I think what they did is they just went down to the tax collector and just paid the bill, because I don't think that they were getting mail there. The guy had been dead since the 70s. The girlfriend had been in a nursing home for quite some time. But again, like I said, you could tell from some of the documents and some of the evidence that it was an orchestrated, this is what the plan is. So they must have done
Yeah.
some internet research to figure that out. But coincidentally enough, I've gotten calls before. It's like, hey, there's a little lady that's in my neighborhood and I know she's went into a nursing home. I've read this thing about adverse possession. How do I do that? So I think especially in areas, I know like areas back east, like in Detroit and some of the areas that have a high foreclosure rate and,
Mhm.
lots of REO properties that are vacant for a long time. It's a serious issue. And they have to make sure that if you are absent from this property and it's vacant, that you're watching it and you're making sure that nobody is trying to move in and try to take possession.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And that's where I think it is so important. We obviously say you can manage your properties from anywhere, but you need someone on the ground there. You need to have someone you trust who's on the ground, even if you're not there.
Yeah.
The real estate market in California is absolutely wild, especially in recent years. Have you seen any trends or legal issues popping up lately that landlords should be aware of?
Yeah, I think that we just have to be really diligent in watching the measures. Luckily, Prop 33 failed.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yes.
but, particularly in the city of LA, we get lots of calls of action from the apartment association because for right now, like I have an urgent message for everybody to go down to the city supervisors because they're going to try to put a halt to evictions for substantial remodel. They're trying to
Mm.
cap the rent increases to 60% of CPI. And so it is really important, especially if they're managing on their own and not involved in anything, is being a part of an apartment association or some service
Yep.
that gives you the alerts. Because that's how I stay on top of things. Urgent alert, this is happening. And then I make sure that we're letting our client base know that you need to go out and talk to, or write letters or oppose this. And so really it's just staying on top of what is happening as the landscape changes so rapidly. And then also just knowing when those changes happen. For instance, I'm dealing with an issue on a property management company that wasn't aware of changes with regards to for a government subsidized potential tenant, you have to give them the option of using a verifiable income versus using their
Yep.
credit report. And that if you don't do that, you can't use their credit report. So they're potentially looking at some claims by two different entities. And it's not just Section 8. There's these church organizations and these other organizations that are also government subsidized that you need to make sure that you're complying. And if you're not up to date on the changes, you can get in real big trouble. So I think that's the biggest mistake is, unfortunately, the mom and pops don't have those resources to stay on top of them, and they need to.
And I couldn't agree more with you. The apartment associations are perfect for that because they pick up your county laws
Yeah.
as well as the state ones and just send it, like you said, as long as you're reading your email, you'll get it in the email. I'm sure you got the apartment association one today on Prop
Yep.
33 and all
Right.
of that stuff. Great.
Yeah.
What's one myth about real estate law you wish you could debunk for landlords and property managers?
So it's more, I think, is doing it yourself. and self-help measures. The things that we come across is people that try to do things on their own without assistance. Even as simple as doing the application process and not
Mhm.
having written criteria. I don't care if you have 1 or 100. If you are not, following the rules of compliance for qualifications and having a written thing, because that's the first thing the ADA complaint will, when the board sends you a letter saying, provide all your written criteria and how you apply those criteria, is they think that it's easy enough and that it's not a big deal to do it themselves. But in our landscape of way it is anybody's going to be offended and think that it is something racially motivated or whatever, with respect to a denial, that if you're not making sure that you have everything in line and in writing, is you could run into trouble. And that goes into the evictions too. People try to start the evictions themselves, and I got one that had spent 4 months just trying to get the complaint filed, and when he hired us, I had it in 3 days. He's like, wow,
Yeah.
okay, I should have just gone to somebody to start. So it's just such a difficult landscape that people want to think that they can do it themselves or use self-help measures. Please don't turn off utilities or lock the doors. I mean,
Yes.
things that I come across, just no, you can't do that.
Yeah, and I think that is one thing. I mean, 72% of landlords self-manage, but it's actually a lot more complicated than you think, and it only takes one bad case to realize your entire cash flow is gone, plus a lot more because you spend so much more on legal fees and hassle and the emotion associated with it. And I love your one about the objective criteria, because you're right. I don't understand why a lot of other apps don't have requirements of like, what's your objective for a criteria of like income to rent ratio, credit, or to your point with government assistance, having an alternative to verify income, that kind of stuff. But having all of that really structured and objective goes a long way. And you really just need to follow a really strict process. Real estate laws, as you just mentioned, gets complicated very quickly. What are some of the most bizarre or unexpected cases you've ever worked on?
I have to say that the most bizarre, and maybe it was that they're unexpected, is the nuisance and uh the the hoarding type situations.
Mm,
It was interesting. It's because my business grew during COVID, because one thing is I'm a litigator and I think of the ways to get things done where other people were shying away from it. So I did a lot of these during COVID, interestingly enough, like one of the more bizarre ones is a woman that chose to do an Airbnb type rental. They just wanted to stay longer, so she agreed, nothing in writing. These people stayed on. And then I had 7 declarations from neighbors because they were hoarding, but they were stealing things from the neighborhood and piling them up in the common area. And so we were able to get it out without a trial on a motion for summary judgment, because I had enough evidence of, because the
mhm.
downstairs person couldn't get in access anymore. It was a fire hazard. There was rats, but they literally, like, I had one declaration where my garden gnome was stolen and added to the pile. Like, things like they just had a pile of neighboring things that were uh, piling up. And the unfortunate thing is, I do have to say, it's a hard job to have, and a lot of people will say that, oh, you're the bad guy, you represent. I know that there's probably lots of mental health issues involved, but it is a business, it is a transaction, and you have to look at the liability for yourselves and to your other residents, and you have to make these moves. Because the other one is that the lady that would run around naked in the yard screaming and yelling
My
at
God.
neighbors, right? So you've got to look at it at an objective standard. Like, yes, I do feel bad that we are unfortunately displacing people, but it's a safety hazard, and it's a liability to landlords if you don't take the actions. If they're fire hazard and have rats, I mean, it's a community issue that just needs to be addressed.
Yeah, yeah. I that is actually, I love the examples that you just gave, because I learned you can't call them hoarders. It's a hoarding disability that they
Correct.
have, and you need to be able, right, to get them help for their disability. And so I agree with you that if you don't do anything, it's actually worse for everyone, the community, the property, the actual person with the disability. And that, to your point, they need help, and there's ways to get them out where this may not be the best living situation for what their disability is. But yeah, those are bizarre, especially the lady running around naked on the lawn. And
Oh,
then
and we've had so
yeah,
much worse. We've got the guy defecating like in the common areas. Like the stuff I see, I just shake my head. And it, like I said, I don't want to come off, sounding like I know that people think, oh, you're a landlord attorney, you're a bad person. And I understand that there is underlying issues behind that, but you have to do what you have to do as an owner to protect yourself.
yep. Yeah, definitely. And I think that upfront, really making sure that you emphasize what's in your lease. I know, Eileen, you help with that, of really making sure that your clients have really concrete leases as well. Helps and goes a long way. Many landlords and property managers deal with tricky tenant situations. What's your advice for landlords when they find themselves in a tough legal bind with a tenant? What are your recommendations of steps to take, and when should they get someone like you, Eileen, involved?
Yeah, I think that sooner rather than later is better if it starts to become um, hostile or adverse. I always recommend having a good relationship with the tenants and communicating without counsel if you can. But the second that it becomes a little bit contentious is probably when you should be careful and get some legal advice. Um, the biggest thing is make sure that things are in writing, and as you're writing things that you're keeping in mind that this is going to be evidence in some form or fashion later. You don't want to make allegations that can't be backed up, but having things in writing, making sure that you have those concrete leases, and that you're abiding by those leases. The other thing is make sure that you're doing inspections. I get people that come across and uh, yeah, my tenants complaining about all these things that are not working, but they never really made a maintenance request. Well, when's the last time you've been in the property? Oh, 5 years ago. Okay, well, one of the
Yeah.
things is to make sure that you're also doing your yearly inspections. The other biggest mistake is not doing rent increases, especially in a city that potentially could have rent control or does have rent control. We get to see that a lot. Oh, I inherited this from my dad or my grandparents and the rent's like $1,000. Can I raise the rent to market? Absolutely not. But if you're doing those yearly rent increases, at least you're staying a little bit of, at least you're getting something and you're not falling more and more behind. But those are kind of the things that I see. And it's unfortunate when people come to me with those situations.
Yeah, I love that one. Because rent increases, they don't have to be a lot, but setting the expectation there will be one, because I've seen situations where an owner doesn't increase the rent for 6 or 7 years and then it's like, great, I'm going to increase it by a huge amount to make up for those 6 or 7 years, assuming it's legal for them to do that. For a tenant, that's a huge shock, because it's like, I was expecting for you not
Yeah.
to increase because you have not historically. But if it's a slight increase every year, the tenant is at least going to expect an increase. And so mentally, it's actually better for the tenant. I
Yeah.
feel in a conversations with tenants, they also prefer to be like, hey, set these expectations up front. So I'm not shocked one year by you suddenly changing a course of action and thinking that you were being too nice to us, rather than just objectively doing things in a very professional manner. Um,
Correct.
you have, Eileen, such a wealth of knowledge. I know your time is so valuable. Before we go to our lightning round, what other advice do you have for landlords out there? And what are some things that you think they should take away?
Yeah, one of the things I come across a lot are the people that own one or two properties and they use their real estate agent to help them do the leasing. The thing that I'm coming across the most is while they're using the forms and the notices and the addendums are attached, they're not always checking the right boxes or doing the right
Hmm.
notices. And they are not attorneys, and so they are not going to be able to give you that legal advice on what to do. And so it's always a good idea, if you're not using some kind of service that is going to help you make sure that you're in compliance. For instance, the California state rent caps and just cause. The
Mhm.
CAR form has a big box in the middle that you have to check if the property is exempt. 8 out of 10 times a client comes to me and that box isn't checked. And so the property isn't truly exempt because that's the requirement. And when I raise this to my real estate agent, contacts and in presentations, they're like, well, we can't advise them on what to do. Well, then you need to tell them to talk to somebody that can, and making sure, because they're like, we don't check those boxes. Well, they need to find
Yeah.
out and make sure that they're doing something. So really, if you're not sure about, and there's so many cities now that have, since 2019, it is just every city is starting to get these rent cap and just cause, and you have to
Mhm.
register the properties. And it's really just getting some platform or service like Hemlane or our office or somebody to really help you, if you're not going to use a property management company, to make sure that you're doing all the things right. Because when stuff comes to us and you aren't, it prohibits us from being able to complete the eviction process until we get all the ducks in a row.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good point because it costs you so much more in the end if you just don't pay the money up front. And you're right, the self management and the free resources out there only get you so far. And so, from that perspective, it's really important to just make sure if you don't know what you're doing, ask for help.
Yep.
Go to Eileen, ask for help. Great. I'd love to go on over to our lightning round. What is the biggest mistake you've made in your real estate investing career?
Not starting sooner.
Great. What is one quote you live by and why?
Uh, they'll never make more property. Um, that's one thing that makes the investment so important, is there's not any more real estate. So if you don't get it now, you're going to lose your chance.
I love that one. Best time to start, right, is 10 years ago, and the next best time is today.
Yeah.
When are you investing next and where?
Yeah, so it could be a couple of things. We have 4 doors in Arizona, and we're just trying to contemplate. But I think our next real investment is a commercial building for my business, and then we can rent the rest out. And it would probably be somewhere in the Torrance, California area. We're hoping to do that in the next 4 years.
Fantastic. And Eileen, I'm sure so many of our listeners are going to want to know more about you, how you can help. I know that you have a 17 video series on evictions and how to go through that process, but tell us a little bit more about which landlords, property managers, any sort of real estate attorney questions that folks may have. What areas do you service? How can folks get in contact with you? And how can our listeners also get go to and view that 17 video series?
Yeah, so we're predominantly in Southern California because it just makes economic sense if you have to go to court. So we're Los Angeles County, Orange County, San Bernardino, Riverside, in that general area. For general stuff, we can, expand, but if it's something that's eviction, I would really usually refer somebody to a local attorney if it's outside of the Southern California realm. 75% of our practice is evictions for landlords. We offer a landlord risk management file. So if you want to have somebody on retainer that you can just ask questions to, look at leases, deal with rent increases. I have some clients that just contact me once a month, and it's a small retainer. It just sits there and it's fully refundable if you ever want to close it. The rest of my practice is more of a civil litigation, boundary line disputes, the adverse possession, specific performance in a real estate contract, disclosure issues, fraud, breach of contract, that type of thing. My website, we do have property guides. So there's a $1.99 download fee if you have one of the cities, like if you have a Culver City property, we have a property guide that tells you all the rent cap and just cause. We're working on getting more cities on there. That's a project we're working on. There's also a video for sale that talks about the new changes in the Tenant Protection Act for substantial remodel and owner occupancy. And then, of course, as you mentioned, I just launched a video series basically walking you through from what you need to have before you get started to a court trial for a non-payment of rent case in California. So if you're not interested in hiring an attorney, this would navigate you through that process on your own. And it's all available at my website.
Great. Well, for those of you who are listening, show link below will have Eileen's website. Eileen, thank you so much. I know your time is precious and really appreciate you being on the show today.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.